Geographers, welcome to week 5. So this week we're going to be looking at chapter 6 and chapter 7. Chapter 6 is Sub-Saharan Africa. Chapter 7 will be North Africa and Southwest Asia. So initially we're going to look at Sub-Saharan Africa. Now this is a big unit. We have 46 nations of Africa's 54 nations. 46 of these are considered Sub-Saharan. So when we look at Sub-Saharan Africa, we're going to examine a little bit about each unique region, which has been very simply characterized from West Africa in places like Nigeria, all the way over to East Africa, which can extend from Ethiopia in the north all the way down to like Kenya, Tanzania. Then we'll look a little bit more Central Africa, which can be anywhere from the Democratic Republic of Congo to the Central African Republic, even down to South Botswana, which is kind of a transition zone as we look at South Africa too. Some of the Southern African nations like Portuguese-speaking Mozambique and Angola, but for the most part we have the South African nation, which is kind of an Anglophile as well as has some Old Dutch if we look at the history of the Boers. This has nothing to speak of some of these indigenous migrations, which we'll look at the movement of peoples across Africa. So we'll look at the Bantu migration coming from West Africa, intermingling with some of the Kushite Empire in the southern or the upper Egyptian valley. And we'll kind of look at how these peoples moved south and interacted and helped people large parts of southern and central Africa. Going forward, we're going to examine a little bit more about the agricultural systems which predominate, which is more of a subsistence-based agricultural regime as opposed to things we're familiar with in North America and even in South America when we look at the Pampas and some of the other Brazilian agricultural zones, which are heavily commercial and oftentimes monocultural. So we're going to look a little bit into agriculture and look at some of the small plot farming that goes on. And this will help play into some of our discussion of overall GDP and earning and some of the differentiation of economies when we look at some of the lower mean income of a lot of the citizens who live in Africa as we understand. As we continue to scan some of these different regionalization patterns, we'll look at some of these economic and cultural trends, and we'll also look at some things regarding the health of the peoples. And this can involve things like endemic tropical diseases, the spread of HIV/AIDS, which is improving greatly, but also things like the vectors of malarial mosquitoes and how this can have an endemic effect on certain affected zones. So we'll examine Africa south of the Sahara, but we'll also get to look into a little bit of medical geography as we examine some of these diffusion patterns. Going forward, we'll do a little bit of examination, continuing our trend of South America by looking at colonialism in Africa. So we'll advance all the way from indigenous cultural geography to the colonial period in the late 19th century. And we'll kind of look at the carving up of Africa a little bit. So continuing on from our South American trends, we have many more European players at the table as opposed to just Portugal and Spain. Continuing on, we'll look a little bit more into the historical and physical and economic factors that have influenced the population trends and the development across Sub-Saharan Africa. And we'll also look at the ranging variety of environmental landscapes and biomes. Finalizing, we'll look a little bit into the history of South Africa and some of the political turmoil which has historically occurred through apartheid and even stuff that's going on contemporarily. So moving forward, we have about 30 more nations to examine with our North Africa, Southwest Asia, which has been conveniently pushed into an acronym of NASWA. Now, this is another sweeping unit. We have the remaining 8 nations of North Africa. And then we have about, maybe about 15 in the Middle East, or what is often considered sometimes referred to as the Arab world, although we will differentiate between the Arab and non-Arab regions within NASWA. Finally, we look further east into Turkestan. So we go all the way, again, from the Atlantic coast of Mauritania and some of these North African zones in the Sahel and the Maghreb, and we're moving all the way over into Turkestan, which is running up against South Asia. So we'll look at the stans, which literally means land of or state of. So you have the state of or the land of the Kyrgyz or the state of, the Uzbeks or the Tajiks. Anyways, we also have some dangling countries such as Azerbaijan and Armenia and Georgia, and we kind of see how these are still caught up, whether or not they're European, whether they're part of Russian regions as they have been historically, or whether or not as they are situated part of Central Asia and Turkestan. Okay, so continuing on as we look into North Africa and Southwest Asia, we're going to examine some of these early civilizational trends that established some of the earliest cultural geography, which would later go on to influence the rise of the Grecian states and eventually influence the West. So we will look at Mesopotamia, and we'll look at things that occurred between the Tigris and the Euphrates with the rise of Sumer, later the rise of Babylon, and the rise of Assyria, and we'll look at some of these early world civilizations. In so doing, we'll get a chance to examine some of the physical terrains of the landscape, and we'll look at how population dispersed, and we kind of look at some of the regional resources which have influenced a lot of these movements. First off, water. We look at a largely arid area, so there's been a lot of protection over the hydrologic development. Who could get water, keep water, purify water, and transport it. This had a lot to do with growth and development patterns in the early world of historical geography. And we'll move forward all the way into contemporary trends when we look at petroleum. So we'll get a little bit of a chance to look at the control over petroleum, which is held by these majority producing nations in OPEC, which is the essentially the oil trading cartel between nations. And we'll kind of look at how this has influenced some of these contemporary regional patterns and how it's often been conflict laden in your guys' particular lifespan. Continuing on, we will extend great distances and cover more countries in this particular week than we will in any other week. So I'll be highly sympathetic to you, and you won't be expected to memorize all 80 countries. If you have any questions, please contact me. We have a lot to cover this week. We'll continue to examine development and underdevelopment trends. We'll continue to look at rural to urban migration, and we'll get a better sense of subsistence agricultural versus commercial agriculture. Bear with us. We have a lot of other things that we'll try to look into as well, such as the spread of culture regarding religious diffusion. So we have Abrahamic religions taking root in this area. So we have the rise of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And we will look at how some of these patterns moved across and dispersed across the land through embodiment and through the spread of ideas and innovations and through military conquest. Hope everyone's enjoying their time so far. This is a big unit, and I encourage you to really dive into it if you can. We have a lot of cool stuff that we can look into, from Egypt and the ancient Egyptian culture on the Nile, all the way to contemporary trends with geopolitics regarding possession of oil and foreign conflict. Thanks, geographers. You're doing great so far.